So, Mr. Galeotti, thank you again for accepting the invitation for this interview. I would like to start by talking about Putin, because you have a whole book about Putin, which is Let's Talk About Putin and What Does the West Does Not Understand About Him. So my first question would be, who is Putin truly, and why doesn't the West understand him correctly? If you can also talk about his KGB past, that would be great, because whenever people talk about him, about Vladimir Putin, they also refer to his past experience as a KGB member.
Yeah, and I think in some ways because it's a nice sort of news hook one, but I don't actually think it's as important as we might think. Look, why did Putin join the KGB? He didn't join the KGB because he wanted to become the sword and shield of the Communist Party. It was precisely that from his point of view, it was the biggest gang in town. You know, this is a guy who came from fairly impoverished background in a still war-scarred Leningrad as was then. And, you know, I think from his point of view, it was the KGB had power and opportunity. And above all, it was the sort of way that someone who didn't have the advantages of being born into a nomenklatura, sort of Communist Party elite family, you know, could rise. So it was always about opportunism. Now, the interesting thing is that he turned out to be a very mediocre KGB officer. You know, he was not one of these sort of the super spies of the films and TV programs that he'd watched and sort of, but you know, a hardworking, solid sort of B, say, definitely not an A-lister. And I think that this left him, look, in part, it meant that he wasn't sort of in the classic security model. He had to, when the Soviet Union collapsed, scramble around and look for economic opportunities. He drove a taxi for a while before getting his proper jobs and reaching his political career. But I think what it really says to me is that Putin is a guy who's always been looking for security. He's always been looking for that sense of, you know, the protection of a gang and such like. And I think this speaks to the whole issue of what the West often doesn't get about Putin. It sees him as very much as this kind of aggressive risk taker, this kind of macho figure, which is exactly the kind of image he has tried to cultivate. You know, all those old photos of him on bare chested and on horseback or holding a gun. You know, this is a man who can't walk past a tank or a fighter jet without a photo opportunity in it. But in practice, if we look at Putin, he's risk averse, and he's someone who, to a large extent out of paranoia, I must say, but nonetheless thinks that he's on the defensive. You know, if you look at his rhetoric, it's very much the West is hostile. The West is trying to encroach on Russia. The West is trying to undermine my government. And that was in many ways one of the key things behind the Ukraine invasion. On the one level, of course, an appalling act of imperialism. But on the other hand, one that's very much driven by he had this belief, this mistaken belief, that it was all because the West was trying to sort of steal Ukraine from Russia and so forth. So I think what we often don't get is that Putin is actually being driven by, and it doesn't justify what he does, but driven by a sense of being under attack, a sense of being under threat, and he's trying to push back against these threats, even if many of these threats are really in his head.
This year in Russia, we will have presidential elections. So how do you think those presidential elections will look like, and what is actually Putin's plan with Russia in the future?
Well, look, I mean, I don't think I'm going to be surprising anyone when I say I think Putin's going to win the elections. I mean, clearly these are not real elections. These are carefully stage-managed pieces of political theater. And from Putin's point of view, I mean, I think it's clear we already had a sort of a sign of how the election campaign is going to be, which is to more or less say, look, there is no alternative. You know, Russia is now beleaguered by its enemies. It needs a strong, experienced leader, and that's me. He's excluded any real opposition candidates from the ballot, whether they're liberals or indeed ultranationalists, like the man Igor Girkin, known by the code words Strelkov, you know, who was one of the so-called turbo patriots who was attacking Putin from the nationalist side of things. No, all of those, they're off. So we basically have a slate of fake candidates. I mean, the communist candidate has already said that he's actually not going to criticize Putin in the campaign. I mean, what kind of election is that? But what it really is about, look, he needs to have this election in order to maintain the pretense of Russia as a democracy. So they're going to have to kind of get it out of the way. But in many ways, it's going to be as low-key a campaign as possible. There's going to be presumably lots of handouts. We've already seen the minimum wage increase quite dramatically at the beginning of this year. There's going to be more handouts for families and for all the other kind of constituencies that he wants to woo. Really, though, I mean, his vision for Russia is not really a vision for Russia. It's a vision for himself. I do wonder if before the invasion, there was a part of him that was getting tired. He's, after all, getting older. He seemed to have a lot less enthusiasm and excitement in the job. And whether he was actually thinking about if there was some way he could hand over power to a trusted successor while still maintaining his own security. Because the trouble is, in this kind of system, rule of law doesn't really exist at the top. Power is what protects you. And if you're going to give power to someone else, you're having to basically put your whole life, your property, your family under the control of another. So I think he might have been toying with that, but now I don't think there's a chance that he can go. I think given the war has been going so badly, he must feel that the risk is that any successor would want to use him as the scapegoat to basically trade for some kind of a deal. He doesn't want to end up inside a war crimes tribunal in The Hague or anything similar. So in some ways, he's stuck. So in some ways, the answer about what he wants for Russia is whatever's going to keep him surviving. So I think he's going to, I mean, the needs of the war are basically making Russia increasingly Soviet in how the economy is controlled and so forth. But he's just going to do whatever he needs to do in order to maintain power and survive for his sake and for the sake of those who are closest to him.
So you are talking about handling power to someone else. Can we think in the future of a new Russian president? How would that person be like?
I mean, I think this is really important because, look, in theory, Putin can remain in power for another 12 years. But in practice, we have to acknowledge that we need to be thinking about a post-Putin Russia, because there will be a post-Putin Russia, and Russia is not going anywhere. We will have to deal with it. Now, obviously, a lot will depend on how Putin manages, or is it wake up? Either way, I am still, in this respect, unfashionably optimistic about Russia, in the sense that I very much see Putin and the people around him. Remember, almost all of the people who he's closest to are similar in age. They're between the ages of about 68 and 74. They're all of the same generation. They're all of the same sort of background. And they are, to me, the last gasp Homo Sovieticus. The people who really had their attitudes and their mindsets fixed in Soviet times and who haven't really managed to adapt to the post-Soviet era. However, almost certainly there will be a political transition to a new political generation. And if you look at the next political generation down, the 60-something-year-olds or the late 50-somethings, they're very different. Not nice people. I mean, on the whole, they are ruthless, self-interested kleptocrats. But that's the whole point. They're corrupt individuals who are interested in having an easy, rich life, rather than having any sort of grand ideological vision for building a Russian empire or anything like that. So, I mean, I think in this context, what I imagine that the next president will be, whether he, and it almost certainly will be a he, comes from, you know, a security background or a political background or an economic one, in some ways it doesn't really matter. They will be interested in stability, in continuing to enrich themselves, but also to enrich themselves, they need to also want to be able to enjoy it. And to put it very glibly, what's the point in stealing money on an industrial scale if your yachts are frozen in a port off Italy, and if all your assets and that nice penthouse that you bought in London is now denied to you, and you can't holiday, you know, in Courchevel to go skiing, or send your mistress to buy new clothes in Milan, or these kind of things. I mean, I know it sounds trivial in the context of, you know, great powers clashing and so forth, but I think, you know, these are the elite's interests. And I think what we'll see is whoever the new president may be, and at this point, it's no point, you know, we can come up with names, but they would just be sort of inventions, really. But nonetheless, I think it will be someone who is more interested in actually rebuilding some kind of a relationship with the West, not because they're nice, not because they're liberal, but because it's pragmatic for them, because they want to return to, in some ways, the good old days when you could steal at home and bank abroad and enjoy your money abroad. So, I mean, I think we will see a change. The final point I would make, though, and an encouraging one really, is look, we see this pattern all around the world and all across history, is that when elites are stealing, they want there to be weak rule of law. Once they've basically stolen everything that is available, they want rule of law because they want to basically fix their possessions. They want to be able to hand it over to the next generation. And therefore, I think this new president, this new political generation may well bring in more rule of law, simply in order to protect their own theft. The good thing is, what we saw in the 1990s in Russia is that you can't build democracy without rule of law. And therefore, if actually this next political generation does bring in rule of law, it brings in the possibility that the next political generation after that, and we're talking 10 years, 20 years down the line, but nonetheless, there is then a chance for real democracy to come to Russia. So there is room for some optimism. Things could go, of course, very badly. We might have some vicious, embittered ultranationalists take over. But I mean, given that we don't know, I would like to err on the side of optimism because there's not much optimism about Russia these days.
What do you think Putin's plan with Ukraine is, and how would you describe the conflict right now?
I mean, right now, frankly, the conflict is, as the Ukrainian military commander-in-chief, General Zaluzhny, said, a stalemate. But of course, stalemates get broken. I mean, this is the situation right now. And we have to recognize that for the next year, probably Russia will be in a stronger position. They've got more ammunition, they've got more production. Western sort of production hasn't really yet come on stream and won't until towards the end of this year. But nonetheless, I don't think it's going to be the sort of advantage that will allow Russia to launch any kind of major offensives. I don't think we're going to see, for the moment at least, either side being able to make any kind of decisive move. Maybe 2025, assuming Ukraine is able to sort of basically stay in the game and it continues to get Western assistance. But in terms of Putin's plan, I mean, I think the honest answer is, look, Putin is not a strategist. He tends to be a tactical opportunist. He responds to the moment. I mean, would he like to see all of Ukraine under, in his sphere of influence? Yes, of course. Is that the only thing he would accept? No. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that essentially Putin will make peace when he feels he has to, and will try and get the best deal he can get at that time. I mean, I think at the moment, I think the Russians would be quite happy if they could just fix the current front lines and more or less make those some kind of de facto border. But on the other hand, I don't think there's any sense that the Ukrainians would be willing to accept that. The problem is this: neither side is currently willing to negotiate because both sides think time is on their side. The Ukrainians think, look, okay, our counteroffensive last year wasn't as impressive as we'd hoped, but nonetheless, give us another year of building up and training and preparing, and then we'll be able to make real territorial gains and kind of impose some kind of deal on Putin. Likewise, Putin thinks, look, Ukrainians are bleeding. Got to recognize they've taken fewer casualties than the Russians, but proportionately they've suffered more because Ukraine's got a much smaller population. And likewise, the West is already showing some degree of unwillingness to continue supporting. So, if I drag this out, at some point, the West will stop giving Ukraine what it needs, and then Ukraine will be in a worse case. So, for the moment, both sides are really sort of sticking it out, and both sides are waiting to see, because there will have to be some kind of a deal. And I have no idea what the contours are. I suspect that the status of Crimea is going to be crucial, because whereas most Russians, they don't care about Donetsk or Luhansk, but they do care about Crimea. It's that one bit of Ukraine that they think is rightfully theirs. And I can't see, but everything else will be up for grabs. But yeah, when we are sadly nowhere near the moment of peace talks now.
So Russia has lost in Ukraine so far around 50,000 soldiers, and there are more than 200,000 wounded. Do you think that these numbers will somehow lead in the future to an anti-government movement or an anti-Putin movement in Russia?
I mean, I think that there's two separate questions there. Is sort of, will it lead to anti-Putin and anti-government feeling, and then will it lead to a movement? A feeling, yes, absolutely. Now, look, the government has done everything it can to try and minimize attention to the scale of casualties. And to a degree, it's had some success, but you can only do that for a while. As more and more people come home in body bags or don't come back at all, then the word goes out. I mean, look, I think back to, look, I did my doctorate on the Soviet war in Afghanistan and the way that that affected the Soviet system, you know, the Soviets having invaded in 79 and fighting all the way through to 1988. And the thing that struck me was there was this point of a kind of critical mass moment where actually people suddenly came to realize just how large was the scale of the war and casualties as a result. The total casualties across that entire war, 10-year war, were 15,000 dead. So, you know, in 10 years, Soviet Union, i.e. a larger country than the Russian Federation, suffered fewer than a third of the casualties that Russia has already taken. So, you know, it's clear that that critical mass is coming soon, especially in the age of the internet and so forth. So I think people are beginning to come aware of that. And we're beginning to see the sort of early signs of some kind of protests, particularly from, you know, the mothers of soldiers, wives and such like, you know, who want their mobilized sort of men folk back home. Because it's a lot harder, let's be honest, particularly in a sort of rather macho type police state as Russia, to actually start cracking down on sort of 60-year-old grandmothers who come out for a peaceful protest. So we're beginning to see that. The question is whether this is actually going to become a political movement. That's a lot harder because in some ways, it's not something that is easily within the gift of the state. You know, we see in opinion polls, and there's now either a majority or a very large minority of Russians who would like to see their troops withdrawn from Ukraine. But that's not at any price. It's not like they want to see that their country lose. Just they would just like to see an end to the war. And I think at the moment that the Kremlin is still able to make this case that, look, you know, it's not like we want this war. We're willing to talk to the Ukrainians, but it's those nasty Ukrainian Nazis who are keeping up the fight. And that's still having some traction. The real fear for the regime is precisely that this war is also having a serious economic impact. Inflation is at about 7.5%. A lot of foodstuffs are actually, you know, inflation is a lot higher. Wages are not increasing proportionately. People, in other words, are, you know, they're feeling the hardships. There's much less spending on social services, on healthcare and such like. And that's what tends to really bring people out on the streets. It's economic issues. The big fear for the government is if the two connect, is if when you have a nation which is already feeling hungry and angry and feeling let down, feeling the social contract with the regime has been broken, that then actually the casualties of the war become a sort of a way of mobilizing that anger. And I think that's a real concern. I don't think we're going to see it certainly for the next 6 months. But I mean, I think that, you know, bit by bit, people are putting the various pieces together and realizing how big a war this is and how far that war, the cost of that war, remember, a third of the entire Russian budget is now being consumed by defense spending. So how far it's the war that is also meaning that their hospitals have less resources and their kids' schools aren't being rebuilt and everything else.
So you were talking at the beginning of the interview about Putin's, let's say, political survival, right? And him not being actually a great strategist. What do you think about people and experts saying that after Ukraine, Putin could attack other countries as well, so the conflict could expand? Do you think that's possible?
I really don't. I think that in part this is a response to the growth of Ukraine fatigue in the West. You know, it is clear that there are politicians and populations who are thinking, you know, do we really need to be spending billions every month, after all, of euros, pounds, and dollars in financial as well as military assistance to keep the Ukraine war going? And I think as a result of that, some people are trying to scare, essentially, political elites and populations alike with this sort of terror that, oh, if we don't do this, then the next thing is Putin's going to invade the Baltic states or Romania or wherever else. Look, First of all, we have to acknowledge that Ukraine has a special place in Putin's heart. Not something that it really should be happy about, because as far as Putin's concerned, Ukraine is not really a foreign country. Ukraine is actually part of, if not part of Russia, but part of a kind of a greater Russia. He doesn't think that about any other country. There is something quite unique about Ukraine and maybe Belarus. Secondly, look, when his military was at its full strength and full capacities, Putin at no point seriously looked as if he wanted to have any kind of military engagement with NATO. Remember, NATO is an alliance with more money, more guns, more advanced troops. NATO has more ground troops in Europe without even any Americans or Canadians than the entire Russian military. So NATO is vastly more powerful. Putin clearly accepts that NATO's Article 5 guarantee, that means an attack on one member state is an attack on all, actually matters. And his military is not only now has been sort of chewed through in Ukraine. I mean, if you can't win a war in Ukraine, why do you think you can win a war against all of NATO? But the idea that within just a few years, I mean, some people are saying, oh, 3 years. Oh, no, it's 2 years. Within a handful of years, Russia will be able to reconstitute its military to where it could threaten NATO. Very, very implausible. If nothing else, you just look at the production capacity of how long it'll take to rebuild all those tanks and so forth, which have been destroyed in Ukraine. So I don't see Putin having a reason to. I don't think Putin has the capacity to. I think this is essentially part of a kind of a political debate that's going on in the West rather than anywhere else. And I think it's dangerous. I mean, I think we ought to be able to defend, if we're going to defend the war in Ukraine and our continued support for the Ukrainians, we should do so on its own terms, rather than simply saying, we're doing this just because otherwise the big bad Russians will come and eat our babies. Because not only is that undervaluing the Ukrainian case, it also runs the risk of creating a backlash when people say, this is just fantasy, this can't happen.
So what should and how should the West approach Russia from now on when it comes to the war in Ukraine?
I mean, in many ways, it'd be nice to have some kind of nice answer to say, aha, I have a 3-point plan to fix everything. There isn't one, unfortunately. To a large degree, it's actually continuing what we're doing. Because look, the cost of supporting Ukraine is entirely supportable. There are ways in which we can make it more equitable. We have to acknowledge that there is a degree in which the Americans can afford to be very bullish about this, because much of the money spent on weapons is being spent in America after all. So, we can think about ways of making it more palatable all around. But generally speaking, doing what we're doing at the moment in terms of supporting Ukraine. However, there are 2 other things I do think we need to be thinking about. First of all is, look, we have to be able to answer that question, how does this end? And that does mean having difficult conversations about what is a sort of a reasonable peace deal. It's all very well saying every single Russian soldier has to withdraw from every single square centimeter of Ukrainian territory. It's really unclear if that is at all realistic. We have to be thinking about, well, as and when there are negotiations, what are we going to encourage the Ukrainians? And obviously, ultimately, it's the Ukrainians' choice. But we also have a say, so long as we're bankrolling this war. What are our views about what is acceptable and not acceptable? At the moment, because it's a very politically divisive and difficult issue, we're not having those conversations. We're hiding behind the mantra of, we'll support the Ukrainians as long as they want. But honestly, we're lying when we say that, because, of course, there are limits to how far we'll be willing to support them. But the second thing is, as I said, we have to be thinking beyond the end of the war and indeed beyond the end of Putin. And my big concern is that at the moment we are doing a lot to demonize Russians. That most Russians are not particularly supportive of this war. Very roughly speaking, there's a quarter who are kind of actively opposed to it. There's a quarter who are essentially supportive. It doesn't mean that they support war crimes and such like, but they feel that Russia has no choice for whatever reason. And about half the population doesn't know what to believe and doesn't really want to think about it. And, they're just basically hiding away. I mean, if you look at, for example, the viewership of news programs on Russian television has fallen dramatically. People just think, no, I can't do anything about it, so I just don't want to know about it. So, we have to recognize that it's not like all Russians are ardent supporters of Putin's ghastly policies. So I think we also need to be doing much more to try and reach out to them, not just simply to be nice, but because it's clever, because we want to undermine Putin's propaganda narrative. Putin's propaganda narrative is basically the West hates Russia and Russians, and we are in a battle for survival. We need to do everything we can to pick away at that. And the trouble is, we've now got a new Iron Curtain coming up. But whereas the old Iron Curtain was put up by the Soviets to stop people from fleeing and to stop ideas coming in from the West, this new Iron Curtain we're putting up to stop Russians from fleeing and to stop their ideas coming over here. So, I mean, I think we need to be more clever in the sense of we can at one time absolutely be supporting Ukraine with whatever it needs, but at the same time be trying to do everything we can to reach out to ordinary Russians and make it clear that ultimately we are not their enemies, that we regard them as Putin's hostages rather than his associates. Because at some point, otherwise, this is going to come back to haunt us. We're going to find that it simply supports the ultra-nationalist narrative. And Putin, fortunately, is not very good at being a nationalist warlord. How scary would it be if Putin was succeeded by someone who was smarter and more energetic and knew what he was doing? So we want to try and ensure that that is not the future that faces us all.
So if we think of a post-Russian Ukrainian war world, how should the West approach the Kremlin? Is isolation or engagement, or what is actually the best, let's say, recipe to actually engage or contain Russia from further attacking other countries in Europe or elsewhere?
I mean, I think there's, as ever, it's a combination of things. I mean, there needs to be a strong deterrent capability, and that means Europe taking security seriously. I mean, it's become a commonplace about how Europe doesn't, and it just simply hides under the American umbrella. But in many ways, frankly, conversation about that is replacing action. Europe does need to get more serious about it, and it doesn't necessarily mean a pan-European Union army or anything like that, because that would take forever to organize and would probably be every bit as efficient as every other aspect of European bureaucracy. No, just individual European member states and NATO member states, have to get more serious about security and about defense, and that will have a powerful deterrent capability. So deterrence is necessary. So too is containment. I mean, look, even when the war is over, we're not going to or should not go back to try and sort of rebuild pre-February 22 relations. There will continue to be some kind of, if not sanctions on Russia, but, for example, controls over the export of technology and investment. So that basically it makes it all the harder for Russia to rebuild the military capabilities that some people say that Putin will use against us. So, there will continue to be that sense, frankly, as long as Putin is in the Kremlin, that actually Russia is a potential antagonist and therefore is under controls. However, the third piece has to precisely be some kind of sense of a road out. It's a little bit like sanctions. We put sanctions on individuals, on various rich Russians, and we don't really give them any way of getting out of that. It's not like we say we're going to freeze your assets and revoke your visas and so forth until you turn around and say that Putin is a bad guy and the invasion was wrong, and until you, I don't know, send a third of your money to support Ukraine or whatever it is that we ask. We just simply say, you're sanctioned, full stop. So what we've done is we've taken a whole bunch of people who weren't really great fans of Putin and put them in a position in which now they become dependent on Putin. They've got nowhere else to go. Well, in some ways, we have to do that with the country itself. If we just simply say, we think Russia is bad and we're going to contain it, then, it has no incentives to basically improve its relationship with us. If we say, look, these are things that we're going to be looking for. It's up to you whether you adopt them. We're not trying to tell you what you must do. But if you want to return to normal relations with us, these are the things we'll be looking at in terms of precisely, proper observation of the rule of law and human rights, not supporting destabilizing sort of campaigns in other countries, not continuing massive disinformation and espionage efforts, all these other kinds of things that Putin's Russia does. But, and at the same time, what we need to say to Russians who think of themselves as Europeans, we should remember, is, look, the family is willing to welcome you back. We're not saying that's it, you're out. We're willing, we're very willing. We're enthusiasts of Russian culture and everything else, but you have to understand that there are kind of rules of the game. So deterrence, a degree of containment, but also making it clear that there is a way back. And I think that's something that really is important to stress.